The hot Georgia sun was beating down hard on Fort Benning that Tuesday morning. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been doing this job for 15 long years, and he thought he knew everything about training new soldiers. He stood there in his perfectly pressed uniform, watching another bus full of young people pull up to the training facility. Rodriguez was known around the base as one of the toughest trainers. He believed that breaking people down first was the only way to build them back up into real soldiers. Some people called his methods old school, but he didn't care what others thought. In his mind, the military needed to be hard, and if you couldn't handle the pressure, you didn't belong there. As the bus doors opened, Rodriguez watched each new recruit step down onto the concrete. He had developed a skill over the years of judging people quickly. Within just a few minutes of seeing someone, he would decide what kind of person they were and how much trouble they would be during training. The first few recruits looked pretty standard to him. There was a tall kid from somewhere in the Midwest who looked nervous but determined. A young woman from California who seemed tough enough to handle whatever came her way. Then there was a guy from Texas who had that confident swagger that usually meant he had worked on a ranch or played football in high school. But then someone else stepped off the bus, and Rodriguez immediately focused all his attention on this young man. The recruit was a 20-year-old from Detroit, and something about him rubbed Rodriguez the wrong way from the very first second. Maybe it was the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. Maybe it was the expensive shoes he was wearing that suggested he came from money. Or maybe it was just the way he looked around the base, like he wasn't impressed by what he saw. Rodriguez decided right then and there that this particular recruit was going to need special attention. In his experience, young people who looked too comfortable needed to be knocked down a few levels before they could learn anything useful. He had seen too many recruits come in thinking they were tough, only to quit when things got difficult. The young man's name was David Thompson, but Rodriguez didn't bother learning his first name right away. He was more interested in making sure Thompson understood that his comfortable life was over and his real education was about to begin. During the first formation, when all the new recruits were lined up in their awkward rows, Rodriguez walked slowly down the line. He looked each person up and down, making mental notes about who would be easy to train and who would give him problems. When he got to Thompson, he stopped walking and stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Well, well," Rodriguez said, loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "Looks like we got ourselves a pretty boy here. Those shoes probably cost more than most people make in a week." Thompson kept his eyes straight ahead and didn't react to the comment. His face showed no emotion, and he didn't even blink. This lack of reaction actually made Rodriguez more annoyed, not less. He had expected the young man to get flustered or angry, but instead Thompson just stood there like a statue. "You think you're tough, don't you?" Rodriguez continued, getting closer to Thompson's face. "I bet you've never done a real day's work in your life. Probably had everything handed to you on a silver plate." The other recruits were starting to feel uncomfortable. They could sense that their drill sergeant had picked out Thompson for special treatment, and they were all grateful it wasn't them getting the attention. Some of them felt bad for Thompson, but they weren't about to speak up and draw attention to themselves. Rodriguez kept pushing. "Let me guess, your mommy drove you to the recruitment office and cried when you signed up? Bet she packed you a nice lunch for your first day too." Still, Thompson didn't react. His jaw tightened slightly, but that was the only sign that Rodriguez's words were having any effect. Thompson had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. He had dealt with people like Rodriguez before, and he knew that getting angry would only make things worse. The truth was that Thompson had grown up hearing much worse things than what Rodriguez was saying. He had learned to keep his emotions under control, even when people were trying their best to get under his skin. His family had taught him that responding to negativity with more negativity never solved anything. But Rodriguez didn't know any of this. He didn't know about Thompson's background or his family history. He didn't know about the struggles Thompson had already faced in his young life, or the strength of character that had brought him to this moment. Rodriguez was making assumptions based on nothing more than appearances, and those assumptions were completely wrong. As the first day of training continued, Rodriguez made sure to single out Thompson whenever possible. During the medical checks, he made Thompson wait longer than everyone else. During the uniform distribution, he gave Thompson sizes that didn't fit properly and then criticized him for looking sloppy. During the room assignments, he made sure Thompson got the worst bunk in the building. The other drill sergeants noticed what Rodriguez was doing, but they didn't say anything. This kind of thing happens sometimes, and they figured Rodriguez must have his reasons. Military training was supposed to be hard, and if Rodriguez wanted to make it extra hard for one particular recruit, that was his business. Thompson took it all without complaining. He fixed his uniform as best he could, made his bunk properly despite the poor mattress, and followed every order exactly as it was given. He didn't try to make friends with the other recruits, but he wasn't unfriendly either. He just focused on doing his job and getting through each day. But inside, Thompson was carrying something that Rodriguez couldn't see. He had secrets and stories that would have completely changed how Rodriguez saw him. His family had a history of military service that went back generations, and Thompson himself had already overcome challenges that would have broken many people. Thompson's grandfather had been a war hero, though Thompson never talked about it. His father had served with distinction in Vietnam, coming home to a country that didn't appreciate his sacrifice. Thompson had grown up hearing stories about duty, honor, and serving your country even when your country didn't always treat you fairly. He had come to Fort Benning not to prove anything to anyone, but because he genuinely believed in serving his country. He wanted to follow in his family's footsteps and make a difference in the world. The expensive shoes Rodriguez had noticed were a gift from his father, who had saved up money to buy them as a reminder that Thompson should never forget where he came from. As the first week continued, Rodriguez's treatment of Thompson became more obvious and more harsh. During physical training, he made Thompson do extra exercises while criticizing his form. During classroom instruction, he questioned Thompson's answers even when they were correct. During mealtimes, he found reasons to make Thompson report to his office instead of eating with the other recruits. The worst part was that Rodriguez seemed to enjoy making Thompson's life difficult. He would smile slightly when Thompson struggled with something, and he would make loud comments about Thompson's performance in front of the whole group. It was clear to everyone that Rodriguez had decided Thompson was his special project. Thompson endured it all with quiet dignity. He never complained, never argued, and never showed any sign that Rodriguez's treatment was bothering him. But late at night, when the other recruits were asleep, Thompson would lie in his bunk and think about his grandfather's stories. He would remember the lessons his father had taught him about staying strong in the face of adversity. The other recruits began to respect Thompson, even though they were afraid to show it openly. They could see that he was being treated unfairly, but they also saw how he handled it with grace and strength. Some of them started to wonder what it was about Thompson that made him so calm under pressure. Rodriguez, meanwhile, was becoming more and more frustrated with Thompson's lack of reaction. He had expected the young man to break down or fight back by now, but instead, Thompson seemed to be getting stronger and more determined with each passing day. This only made Rodriguez push harder, convinced that he just needed to find the right pressure point to crack Thompson's composure. What Rodriguez didn't realize was that he was making a terrible mistake. He was judging Thompson based on prejudice and assumptions instead of taking the time to learn who Thompson really was. If Rodriguez had bothered to look at Thompson's file or ask about his background, he would have discovered information that would have shocked him to his core. But Rodriguez was too busy trying to prove his point to bother with facts. He had decided that Thompson was weak and privileged, and he was determined to prove himself right no matter what it took. This attitude was setting up a confrontation that would eventually force both men to face truths they weren't prepared for. As the first 3 weeks of training passed, the tension between Rodriguez and Thompson continued to build, while the other recruits watched and waited to see what would happen next. The 4th week of training started like any other, but something was different in the air. Rodriguez had been getting more and more frustrated with Thompson's calm behavior. Every morning he would wake up thinking of new ways to test the young recruit's limits. He was convinced that everyone had a breaking point, and he was determined to find Thompson's. Thompson, on the other hand, was starting to show small signs of wear. He still maintained his quiet dignity, but the constant pressure was taking its toll. He had lost some weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes from the lack of proper sleep. Rodriguez would often call him out of his bunk in the middle of the night for extra duties or uniform inspections that served no real purpose except to wear him down. The other recruits in the platoon were starting to feel uncomfortable about the whole situation. They could see that what Rodriguez was doing to Thompson went far beyond normal military training. During their free time, some of them would quietly talk among themselves about how unfair it all seemed. But none of them were brave enough to speak up directly, knowing that challenging a drill sergeant could make their own lives much more difficult. One recruit named Kevin from Ohio started to feel particularly bad about staying silent. He had grown up in a family that taught him to stand up for what was right, and watching Thompson suffer alone was eating at his conscience. But every time Kevin thought about saying something, he would remember stories about recruits who had been kicked out of training for causing trouble. Rodriguez seemed to sense that the other recruits were starting to sympathize with Thompson, which only made him more determined to prove his point. He began making examples of Thompson in front of the entire group, using him as a lesson about what happened to people who thought they were better than everyone else. During one particularly hot afternoon, Rodriguez announced that the platoon would be doing an extra training exercise in the Georgia heat. The temperature was over 90 degrees, and the humidity made it feel even hotter. All the recruits were sweating heavily within minutes of starting the exercise, but Rodriguez seemed to have endless energy when it came to making Thompson's life difficult. Thompson had been feeling sick to his stomach for the past 2 days, but he hadn't reported to the medical clinic. He knew that Rodriguez would use any sign of weakness against him, calling him soft or saying he was looking for excuses to get out of training. So Thompson kept his mouth shut and tried to push through the discomfort, even though he was feeling worse with each passing hour. The exercise involved running between different stations while carrying heavy equipment. At each station, the recruits had to complete a series of physical challenges before moving on to the next one. Rodriguez made sure that Thompson's equipment was always a little heavier than everyone else's, and he would time Thompson's performance more strictly than the others. As the afternoon wore on, Thompson's stomach problems got worse. He was feeling dizzy and nauseous, but he forced himself to keep going. He had learned long ago that showing weakness in front of people like Rodriguez would only make things worse. His father had taught him that sometimes you had to endure pain quietly in order to prove your strength. But Thompson's body was reaching its limits. The combination of the heat, his illness, and the constant stress of Rodriguez's harassment was becoming too much to handle. During one of the running portions of the exercise, Thompson stumbled and almost fell. He caught himself quickly and kept going. But Rodriguez had been watching and saw exactly what happened. This was the moment Rodriguez had been waiting for. He saw Thompson stumble as proof that the young man was finally starting to crack under pressure. Instead of showing any concern for Thompson's well-being, Rodriguez saw an opportunity to deliver what he thought would be the final blow to Thompson's pride. Rodriguez called the entire platoon to gather around, making Thompson stand in the center of the circle. The other recruits looked uncomfortable, but they had no choice but to follow orders. Thompson stood there swaying slightly, trying to focus on staying upright while Rodriguez prepared to unleash his most devastating attack yet. What happened next shocked everyone who witnessed it. Rodriguez began a verbal assault that went far beyond anything he had done before. He questioned Thompson's character, his background, and his right to be there. He used language that made several of the other recruits look down at their feet in embarrassment. Rodriguez seemed to lose control of himself, saying things that crossed lines that should never be crossed. The worst part was that Rodriguez seemed to enjoy watching Thompson struggle to maintain his composure. He kept pushing harder and harder, using words that were meant to cut deep and cause maximum emotional damage. The other recruits were horrified by what they were hearing, but they were too scared to intervene. Thompson stood there taking it all, his fists clenched at his sides and his jaw tight with the effort of staying silent. But something was building inside him that had been growing for weeks. All the unfair treatment, all the extra punishment, all the sleepless nights and constant harassment were adding up to a moment that would change everything. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Thompson had heard enough. But instead of exploding with anger the way Rodriguez expected, Thompson did something completely different. He looked Rodriguez straight in the eyes and spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried clearly across the entire training ground. "Drill Sergeant Rodriguez," Thompson said, his voice steady despite everything he had just endured. "I want you to know something about who I am and why I'm here." Rodriguez was so surprised by Thompson's calm response that he stopped talking and just stared at the young man. He had expected tears, anger, or even Thompson to quit on the spot. Instead, Thompson was speaking with a dignity and strength that caught Rodriguez completely off guard. Thompson continued, his voice never rising, but somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. "My grandfather earned a Purple Heart fighting for this country during World War II. He came home to a nation that didn't always appreciate his sacrifice, but he never complained about it. He taught my father that serving your country wasn't about getting recognition or respect. It was about doing what was right even when doing what was right was hard." The other recruits were listening with growing amazement. This was the first time any of them had heard Thompson talk about his family, and they were starting to understand that there was much more to him than any of them had realized. Thompson kept talking, and with each word, Rodriguez felt something shifting inside his chest. "My father served 3 tours of duty in Vietnam. When he came home, there were no parades or celebrations. People called him names and treated him like he was the enemy. But he never let that bitterness change who he was. He taught me that you don't serve your country to prove anything to anyone else. You serve because it's the right thing to do." Rodriguez was starting to feel uncomfortable in a way he had never experienced before. Something about Thompson's words was hitting him in a place he didn't expect. The young man wasn't fighting back with anger or insults. Instead, he was sharing something personal and powerful that was making Rodriguez question his own behavior. "I didn't come here to prove I was tough," Thompson continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "I didn't come here to show off or to get special treatment. I came here because my family taught me that this country is worth serving, even when this country doesn't always serve us back." The entire training ground had gone completely silent. Even Rodriguez seemed speechless, staring at Thompson like he was seeing him for the first time. The other recruits were looking back and forth between their drill sergeant and Thompson, sensing that something important was happening, but not quite understanding what it was. Thompson wasn't finished. "You've spent these past weeks trying to break me down because you think I'm weak or spoiled or don't belong here, but you don't know anything about me or my family. You don't know what we've been through or what we've sacrificed. You've judged me based on how I look instead of who I am." Rodriguez felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Thompson's words were calm and respectful, but they cut deeper than any angry outburst could have. For the first time in weeks, Rodriguez was seeing Thompson not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with his own story and his own reasons for being there. The confrontation ended with Thompson standing tall and Rodriguez struggling to find words. Something had fundamentally changed in that moment, though Rodriguez wasn't ready to admit it yet. His pride was still telling him that he was right and Thompson was wrong, but a small voice in the back of his mind was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had made a terrible mistake. As the platoon was dismissed and the recruits headed back to their barracks, Rodriguez stood alone on the training ground, Thompson's words echoing in his mind. For the first time in his career, he was starting to question whether his methods were really making better soldiers, or if he was just making people suffer for no good reason. That night, Rodriguez couldn't sleep. Thompson's mention of his grandfather's Purple Heart and his father's service in Vietnam kept running through his mind. Something about those details felt familiar, but Rodriguez couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. He had a nagging feeling that there was more to this story than he understood, and that feeling was going to keep him awake until he figured out what it meant. Rodriguez sat in his small office that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The clock on his desk showed it was past midnight, but sleep seemed impossible. Thompson's words kept playing over and over in his mind like a broken record. Something about what the young man had said felt important, but Rodriguez couldn't figure out what it was. He had been a drill sergeant for 15 years, and he thought he had seen everything. He had dealt with tough guys who tried to fight back, scared kids who cried for their mothers, and everything in between. but he had never encountered someone like Thompson. The way the young man had spoken with such calm dignity, even after weeks of harassment, had shaken Rodriguez more than he wanted to admit. Rodriguez got up from his chair and walked to the small window that looked out over the dark training grounds. He could see the barracks where all the recruits were sleeping, and he wondered if Thompson was lying awake too, thinking about their confrontation. Part of Rodriguez wanted to believe that he had been doing the right thing all along, that tough training was necessary to build strong soldiers. But another part of him was starting to question everything. The mention of Thompson's grandfather earning a Purple Heart during World War II kept bothering Rodriguez. There was something familiar about that detail, something that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite reach. Rodriguez had grown up hearing stories about his own grandfather's service in the war, and he had a strange feeling that there might be some connection he was missing. Unable to shake the feeling, Rodriguez turned on his computer and decided to do something he probably should have done weeks ago. He pulled up Thompson's military file and began reading through it carefully. What he found in the first few pages made him sit up straighter in his chair. Thompson's full name was David Thompson, Jr., and his father was listed as Colonel David Thompson, Sr., currently serving at the Pentagon. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized that he had been harassing the son of a high-ranking officer. But that wasn't the worst part. As he kept reading, Rodriguez discovered information that made his hands start to shake. Thompson's grandfather was listed as Staff Sergeant William Thompson, a decorated Marine who had served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. The file showed that William Thompson had earned his Purple Heart during the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945. After being wounded while saving the life of a fellow Marine, Rodriguez felt like the room was spinning around him. The Battle of Iwo Jima was exactly where his own grandfather had served. Corporal Jose Rodriguez had been wounded during that same battle and had been saved by a black Marine who carried him to safety under enemy fire. Rodriguez had grown up hearing that story over and over again, because his grandfather never forgot the man who had saved his life. With trembling fingers, Rodriguez opened another screen on his computer and began searching through military records. He typed in his grandfather's name and service details, looking for the official report of what had happened during the battle. When he found the document, Rodriguez felt like he might be sick. The report clearly stated that Corporal Jose Rodriguez had been wounded by enemy fire and was saved by Staff Sergeant William Thompson, who carried him to safety despite being under heavy attack. Both men had been awarded medals for their service, and the report noted that Thompson had been wounded while performing the rescue. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he had just discovered. The young man he had been tormenting for weeks was the grandson of the person who had saved his own grandfather's life. Without William Thompson's heroic actions, Jose Rodriguez would have died on that battlefield, and Rodriguez himself would never have been born. The irony was almost too much to bear. Rodriguez had spent weeks assuming that Thompson was weak and privileged, when in reality Thompson came from a family with a stronger military tradition than Rodriguez's own family. Thompson's grandfather had literally been a war hero, and his father was currently serving as a colonel in the United States Army. Rodriguez spent the next several hours reading everything he could find about the Thompson family's military service. What he discovered made him feel smaller and smaller with each new piece of information. William Thompson had not only saved Rodriguez's grandfather, but had gone on to serve with distinction throughout the rest of the war. After coming home, he had faced discrimination and unfair treatment, but had never let it make him bitter or angry. David Thompson Sr. had followed in his father's footsteps, serving 3 tours in Vietnam and earning multiple commendations for his service. The record showed that he had volunteered for dangerous missions and had always put the welfare of his soldiers above his own safety. After the war, he had come home to a country that didn't appreciate his sacrifice, but he had continued to serve his country in various roles until reaching his current position at the Pentagon. As Rodriguez read through the family history, he began to understand where David Thompson Jr. had learned his quiet strength and dignity. The young man came from a long line of people who had faced adversity with grace and had served their country even when their country didn't always serve them back. The most painful part for Rodriguez was reading about the discrimination that both William Thompson and David Thompson Sr. had faced during their military careers. Despite their heroic service and dedication, they had often been treated unfairly because of their race. They had endured harassment, unfair treatment, and constant questioning of their abilities, but they had never let it change their commitment to doing what was right. Rodriguez realized with growing horror that he had been doing the exact same thing to David Thompson Jr. that previous generations had done to his father and grandfather. He had judged the young man based on prejudice and assumptions, rather than taking the time to learn who he really was, or what his family had contributed to the country. The weight of his mistake was crushing. Rodriguez had always thought of himself as a good soldier and a fair person, but his treatment of Thompson had been neither good nor fair. He had let his own biases blind him to the truth, and in doing so he had dishonored not only Thompson, but also the memory of Thompson's grandfather, who had saved Rodriguez's own family line. As the night wore on, Rodriguez found himself reading and rereading the accounts of William Thompson's heroic actions during the Battle of Iwo Jima. The reports described how Thompson had risked his own life repeatedly to help wounded soldiers, and how he had never hesitated to put himself in danger to protect others. The man had been a true hero in every sense of the word. Rodriguez also found letters that his grandfather had written after the war, letters that had been preserved in the family for decades. In these letters, Jose Rodriguez had written about the Black Marine who had saved his life, describing him as one of the bravest and most honorable men he had ever known. Jose Rodriguez had never forgotten William Thompson's sacrifice and had always spoken of him with the deepest respect and gratitude. Reading his grandfather's words about William Thompson made Rodriguez feel even worse about his own behavior. His grandfather had understood the true character of the man who saved him, but Rodriguez had failed to see that same character in William Thompson's grandson. Instead of honoring the Thompson family's legacy of service, Rodriguez had tried to tear it down. The more Rodriguez learned about the Thompson family, the more ashamed he became of his own actions. These were people who had given everything for their country, who had faced discrimination and hardship with dignity, and who had never let adversity change their fundamental belief in doing what was right. They represented the very best of what military service could be. As dawn began to break outside his office window, Rodriguez finally understood the full magnitude of what he had done. He had not just been unfair to one young recruit. He had dishonored a family that had served with distinction for generations. He had let his prejudices make him blind to the very qualities he was supposed to be building in soldiers: courage, honor, and dedication to something greater than yourself. Rodriguez knew that he had to make this right, but he wasn't sure how. An apology seemed inadequate for what he had done, but it was the only place he could start. He also knew that his actions had been witnessed by the entire platoon, and that he would need to acknowledge his mistake publicly if he wanted to maintain any credibility as a leader. The hardest part was admitting to himself that everything he thought he knew about Thompson had been wrong. The young man wasn't weak or privileged or looking for special treatment. He was the product of a family tradition of service and sacrifice that went back generations. He had come to Fort Benning not to prove anything to anyone, but to continue a legacy of honor that his grandfather and father had established before him. As Rodriguez sat in his office watching the sun rise over the training grounds, he made a decision that would change both his life and Thompson's. He was going to do something that he had never done before in his 15 years as a drill sergeant. He was going to admit that he had been completely wrong, and he was going to do it in front of everyone who had witnessed his mistakes. The revelation about Thompson's family history had opened Rodriguez's eyes to his own prejudices and failures as a leader. But more than that, it had shown him what true strength and character looked like. Thompson had endured weeks of unfair treatment without losing his dignity or his commitment to serving his country. That was the kind of soldier Rodriguez should have been trying to build, not tear down. Rodriguez spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for what would be one of the most difficult moments of his career. He was about to face the consequences of his prejudice and try to make amends for the harm he had caused. The morning formation started like any other day. The recruits lined up in their neat rows, standing at attention while waiting for their daily instructions. But something was different about Rodriguez that morning. He had barely slept, and the weight of what he had discovered was written all over his face. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by something the recruits had never seen before: uncertainty. Thompson stood in his usual spot, showing no signs that the previous day's confrontation had affected him. He looked as composed and dignified as ever, his uniform perfectly pressed and his posture straight. The other recruits kept stealing glances at him, wondering if anything would be different after what had happened the day before. Rodriguez walked slowly in front of the formation, his hands clasped behind his back. Normally, he would have started, barking out orders by now, but instead he seemed to be gathering his thoughts. The silence stretched on longer than usual, making everyone feel uncomfortable. Some of the recruits began to wonder if Rodriguez was planning some new form of punishment for Thompson. Finally, Rodriguez stopped walking and turned to face the platoon. When he spoke, his voice was different from what they were used to hearing. It was quieter, less harsh, and carried a weight that none of them had heard before. "Before we begin training today," Rodriguez said, looking directly at Thompson, "I need to address something that happened yesterday. Private Thompson, front and center." Thompson stepped forward without hesitation, his face showing no emotion. He had been expecting some kind of retaliation for speaking up the day before, and he was prepared to face whatever Rodriguez had planned for him. The other recruits held their breath, wondering what was about to happen. But instead of launching into another verbal attack, Rodriguez did something that shocked everyone present. He slowly removed his drill sergeant hat, a gesture that none of the recruits had ever seen before. In military culture, removing your hat was a sign of deep respect, something that drill sergeants simply didn't do in front of recruits. "Private Thompson," Rodriguez began, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I can ever properly give." The entire platoon seemed to freeze. No one could believe what they were hearing. Drill sergeants didn't apologize to recruits, it just didn't happen. But Rodriguez was clearly about to break that unwritten rule in the most public way possible. Rodriguez took a deep breath and continued. "Last night, I did something I should have done weeks ago. I actually took the time to learn about who you are and where you come from. What I discovered has changed everything I thought I knew about you." Thompson's expression remained neutral, but Rodriguez could see a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. The young man had no idea what Rodriguez had discovered, but he could sense that something significant was about to happen. "Your grandfather," Rodriguez continued, his voice getting stronger, "was Staff Sergeant William Thompson. He served with honor during World War II and earned a Purple Heart at the Battle of Iwo Jima." Several of the recruits exchanged glances, impressed by this revelation but not understanding why Rodriguez was sharing it. They had no idea where this was leading, but they could tell it was important. Rodriguez's voice began to shake slightly as he continued. "What you don't know, and what I only discovered last night, is that your grandfather saved my grandfather's life during that battle. Corporal Jose Rodriguez was wounded by enemy fire, and Staff Sergeant William Thompson carried him to safety under heavy attack. Without your grandfather's heroic actions, my grandfather would have died on that battlefield, and I would never have been born." The silence that followed was complete. Every recruit in the formation was trying to process what they had just heard. The implications were staggering. Rodriguez had been tormenting the grandson of the man who had saved his own family line. Thompson's composed facade finally cracked slightly. His eyes widened as he absorbed the incredible coincidence that had brought them together. He had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's heroic actions during the war, but he had never imagined that those actions would connect him to the drill sergeant who had made his life so difficult. Rodriguez continued, his shame evident in every word. "For the past few weeks I have treated you with disrespect and cruelty, based on nothing more than my own prejudices and assumptions. I judged you by how you looked instead of who you are. I made assumptions about your character without taking the time to learn about your family's incredible legacy of service." The other recruits were listening in stunned silence. Many of them had felt uncomfortable watching Rodriguez's treatment of Thompson, but none of them had imagined that there was such a deep personal connection involved. "Your grandfather was a hero," Rodriguez said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "He risked his life repeatedly to save others, including my own grandfather. Your father served 3 tours in Vietnam with distinction, coming home to a country that didn't appreciate his sacrifice. And you came here not to prove anything to anyone, but to continue a family tradition of service that goes back generations. Rodriguez paused, struggling with the weight of his next words. I have dishonored not only you, but the memory of your grandfather and the service of your father. I have let my own biases make me blind to the very qualities I'm supposed to be building. In soldiers, courage, honor, and dedication to something greater than yourself. Thompson stood perfectly still, but Rodriguez could see that his words were having an impact. The young man's eyes were bright with emotion, though he maintained his military bearing. Rodriguez then did something that no one in the platoon expected. He stepped forward and extended his hand to Thompson. In front of everyone, the drill sergeant was offering a handshake to a recruit, something that violated every protocol they knew about military hierarchy. Private Thompson, Rodriguez said, his hand still extended. I am asking for your forgiveness, though I know I don't deserve it. I am also asking you to help me become a better leader and a better man. Thompson looked at the extended hand for a long moment. Everyone in the formation was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The young man had every right to reject Rodriguez's gesture, to hold on to his anger and resentment for the weeks of unfair treatment he had endured. Instead, Thompson stepped forward and grasped Rodriguez's hand firmly. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying across the entire formation. Drill Sergeant Rodriguez, Thompson said, my grandfather taught my father, and my father taught me, that we don't serve for recognition or to prove we belong. We serve because America is worth serving, even when America doesn't always serve us back. Rodriguez felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to Thompson's words. The young man was showing him grace and forgiveness that he didn't deserve, responding to hatred with dignity and understanding. Thompson continued, still holding Rodriguez's hand. My family has faced discrimination and unfair treatment for generations, but we've never let it change our belief in doing what's right. My grandfather would have saved your grandfather regardless of who he was or where he came from, because that's what good soldiers do. They protect each other. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime to everyone watching. When they finally released each other's hands, something fundamental had changed between them. The animosity and tension that had defined their relationship was replaced by something much more powerful: mutual respect. Rodriguez turned to address the entire platoon, his voice now strong and clear. Let this be a lesson to all of us, he said. Prejudice makes us blind to the very things we should be celebrating. Private Thompson has shown more courage and character in the past few weeks than I have shown in years. He has demonstrated what it truly means to serve with honor. From that day forward, everything changed. Rodriguez became Thompson's strongest supporter and advocate. He made sure that Thompson received the training and opportunities he deserved, and he never again allowed his prejudices to cloud his judgment about any recruit. Thompson, for his part, never held Rodriguez's past behavior against him. He understood that people could change and grow, and he was willing to give Rodriguez the chance to prove that he had learned from his mistakes. The two men developed a relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to military excellence. The other recruits watched this transformation with amazement. They saw how Rodriguez changed from a bitter, prejudiced leader into someone who truly cared about bringing out the best in his soldiers. They also saw how Thompson's grace and forgiveness had the power to change hearts and minds. As the weeks passed, Thompson excelled in his training. He graduated at the top of his class, earning the respect of his instructors and fellow recruits. Rodriguez was there at the graduation ceremony, beaming with pride as Thompson received his honors. Years later, Rodriguez would tell other drill sergeants about the lesson Thompson had taught him. He would explain how his own prejudices had nearly caused him to destroy a young man whose family had given more to America than Rodriguez had ever imagined. He would talk about how Thompson's dignity and grace had opened his eyes to the damage that assumptions and bias could cause. Thompson went on to become an officer, following in his father's footsteps. He served with distinction, always remembering the lessons his family had taught him about serving with honor regardless of how others treated him. He never spoke negatively about Rodriguez, understanding that their story was ultimately one of redemption and growth. The story of Rodriguez and Thompson became legendary at Fort Benning. It was told to new classes of recruits as an example of how prejudice can blind us to the very qualities we should be nurturing, and how grace and forgiveness can transform even the most difficult situations. Rodriguez retired from the military with the knowledge that Thompson had made him a better leader and a better person. He had learned that true strength comes not from tearing people down, but from building them up. And he had discovered that sometimes the people we judge most harshly are the ones who have the most to teach us about courage, honor, and the true meaning of service.